In the winter of 1872, deep within the remote wilderness of the Ozark Mountains, a traveling merchant named Samuel Morrison made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. What he found in a seemingly welcoming farmhouse would expose one of the most disturbing cases of systematic cannibalism in American history, a family operation so methodical and extensive that it challenged everything authorities thought they knew about the depths of human depravity. The Ashcroft family had been operating what appeared to be a humble roadside inn for nearly 2 decades, offering food and shelter to weary travelers passing through the treacherous mountain passes. But beneath their facade of frontier hospitality lay a horror so profound that when the truth finally emerged, it would shake the foundations of civilized society and force lawmakers to confront the reality that monsters could hide behind the most ordinary faces. Before we delve into this extraordinary case that shocked the nation, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into history's darkest mysteries. And please, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love connecting with fellow truth seekers around the world who aren't afraid to confront the shadows of our past. The Ozark Mountains of Arkansas in 1872 were a frontier region where civilization's reach was tenuous at best. These ancient hills, carved by millennia of erosion into a labyrinth of valleys and ridges, harbored communities that operated by their own rules, far from the oversight of federal marshals or state authorities. It was a place where a man's past could be buried as deep as the mountain hollows, and where questions about one's origins were considered impolite at best, dangerous at worst. The region attracted those seeking to escape their previous lives, former Confederate soldiers avoiding Reconstruction authorities, outlaws fleeing justice, and families whose reputations had been destroyed by scandal or tragedy. In this environment, the Ashcroft family's arrival in 1853 had raised few eyebrows. They were simply another group of settlers seeking a fresh start in the unforgiving wilderness. Jeremiah Ashcroft presented himself as a widowed farmer from Tennessee, traveling with his 3 adult children and their families in search of fertile land and new opportunities. The family claimed that they had lost everything during a series of crop failures and were hoping to establish a new homestead in the Arkansas mountains. Their story was common enough that it attracted no particular attention from the sparse population of existing settlers. The Ashcrofts chose to establish their homestead in a strategic location, along one of the few reliable routes through the mountains. Their property sat at the intersection of 2 ancient Indian trails that had been widened into rough wagon roads, making it a natural stopping point for travelers making the difficult journey between the settled regions of Arkansas and the frontier territories beyond. Within a few years, the Ashcrofts had built what appeared to be a thriving roadside business. Their main building was a large 2-story structure that served as both family residence and inn for travelers. They offered simple but hearty meals, clean beds, and care for horses and livestock. Their prices were reasonable, their hospitality genuine, and their reputation among the sparse population of regular travelers was excellent. Jeremiah Ashcroft was a man of imposing physical presence, standing well over 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders and calloused hands of someone who had spent his life in hard physical labor. His weathered face bore the lines of a man who had seen considerable hardship, but his manner with guests was invariably courteous and welcoming. He spoke with the slow, measured cadence typical of mountain folk, and his knowledge of local trails and conditions made him a valuable source of information for travelers planning their routes. His eldest son, Ezekiel, was cut from the same cloth, a large, powerful man who handled most of the physical work around the property. Ezekiel's wife, Martha, managed the cooking and housekeeping, while their 2 teenage children helped with various chores around the inn. The middle son, Caleb, was responsible for tending the livestock and maintaining the outbuildings, while the youngest son, Isaiah, served as a guide for travelers who needed assistance navigating the more treacherous mountain passes. To all outward appearances, the Ashcrofts were exactly what they claimed to be, a hard-working frontier family making an honest living by providing essential services to travelers in a dangerous and isolated region. Their inn became known as a reliable haven for those brave enough to attempt the mountain crossing, and word of their hospitality spread throughout the region. But beneath this facade of frontier respectability, the Ashcroft family was conducting a business far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. They had discovered that their isolated location and reputation for hospitality provided the perfect cover for a systematic operation of robbery and murder that would claim dozens of victims over the course of nearly 2 decades. The family's method was as simple as it was effective. They would welcome travelers with genuine warmth and hospitality, providing excellent food and comfortable accommodations. During the evening meal and conversation, they would carefully assess each guest, determining their wealth, their destination, and most importantly, whether their disappearance would be quickly noticed or investigated. Wealthy merchants traveling alone were ideal targets, as were groups of settlers heading to remote territories, where their failure to arrive might not be discovered for months or even years. The Ashcrofts became expert at identifying travelers who carried significant amounts of cash or valuable goods, and who had no immediate family or business associates expecting their arrival at a specific time and place. Once they had identified suitable victims, the family would wait until their guests had retired for the evening, often after sharing drinks that had been laced with a mild sedative derived from local plants. When the victims were deeply asleep, family members would enter their rooms and dispatch them quickly and quietly, usually with a blow to the head or a knife to the throat. The bodies would then be stripped of all valuables and clothing before being taken to a specially constructed processing area in the basement of the main building. Here the Ashcrofts had created what could only be described as a human butcher shop, complete with hooks, cutting tables, and storage areas designed specifically for the systematic dismemberment and preservation of human remains. But the Ashcrofts' operation went far beyond simple robbery and murder. They had discovered that human flesh, when properly prepared and preserved, could provide a reliable source of protein that supplemented their other food sources and reduced their dependence on hunting and livestock. What had perhaps begun as a desperate measure during a particularly harsh winter had evolved into a systematic practice that the family had come to view as simply another aspect of their frontier survival strategy. The family had developed sophisticated techniques for processing human remains, using methods adapted from traditional meat preservation practices. They had learned to cure human flesh using salt and smoke, creating jerky and other preserved meats that could be stored for extended periods. They had also discovered which cuts were most palatable and how to prepare them in ways that disguised their true nature. Most disturbing of all, the Ashcrofts had begun serving human flesh to their unsuspecting guests, mixing it with pork and beef in stews and roasts that were praised by travelers for their exceptional flavor and tenderness. The family took a perverse pride in their culinary skills, viewing their ability to prepare human flesh in appetizing ways as a mark of their resourcefulness and adaptability. This practice served multiple purposes beyond simple nutrition. It helped dispose of evidence that might otherwise be discovered, and it provided a twisted form of entertainment for the family members, who would watch with amusement as their guests unknowingly consumed the flesh of previous victims. The psychological satisfaction they derived from this deception seemed to be almost as important to them as the practical benefits. The Ashcrofts had also developed an elaborate system for disposing of evidence and maintaining their cover. Bones and other inedible remains were either burned in specially constructed furnaces or buried in remote locations throughout their extensive property. Personal belongings of victims were either kept as trophies, sold to unscrupulous traders, or destroyed to eliminate any trace of their former owners. The family maintained detailed records of their victims, including physical descriptions, estimated wealth, and notes about the quality and quantity of meat obtained from each person. These records were kept in a hidden compartment in Jeremiah's study, written in a crude cipher that the family had developed to prevent their activities from being discovered if the documents were found by outsiders. The psychological dynamics within the Ashcroft family were complex and disturbing. Jeremiah served as the undisputed leader, making all major decisions about which travelers to target and how to dispose of the evidence. His sons followed his orders without question, having been indoctrinated into the family's cannibalistic practices from an early age. The women of the family, while not directly involved in the killing, were active participants in the processing and preparation of human flesh. Perhaps most disturbing was the involvement of the younger generation. The Ashcroft grandchildren, ranging in age from 8 to 16, had been raised to view cannibalism as a normal and acceptable practice. They helped with various aspects of the operation, from luring victims into vulnerable positions to assisting with the butchering and preservation process. The family had created its own twisted moral universe in which the consumption of human flesh was not only acceptable but necessary for survival. The children had been systematically desensitized to violence and death through a gradual process that began in their earliest years. They were first exposed to the butchering of animals, then gradually introduced to the processing of human remains. By the time they reached adolescence, they were full participants in the family's criminal enterprise, viewing the murder and consumption of travelers as simply another aspect of their daily routine. The family had developed elaborate rituals around their cannibalistic practices, treating the consumption of human flesh as a sacred act that bound them together and separated them from the outside world. These rituals included prayers of thanksgiving for their victims, ceremonial preparation of certain cuts of meat, and the sharing of specific organs among family members according to a complex hierarchy of status and responsibility. The Ashcrofts believed that consuming human flesh gave them special powers and abilities that ordinary people did not possess. They thought that by eating the hearts of their victims, they could absorb their courage and strength. By consuming the brains, they believed they could gain their victims' knowledge and memories. These beliefs had become so deeply ingrained in the family's worldview that they genuinely saw themselves as superior beings who had transcended normal human limitations. The family's cannibalistic practices had also taken on a distinctly religious character over the years. They had developed their own twisted theology that justified their actions as part of a divine plan. According to their beliefs, they were chosen instruments of God's will, tasked with purifying the world by consuming the flesh of the unworthy. This religious framework provided them with a sense of moral justification for their crimes and helped to maintain their psychological stability despite the horrific nature of their actions. The Ashcrofts had established a complex hierarchy within their family structure that determined who had access to which parts of their victims' bodies. Jeremiah, as the patriarch, had first choice of all organs and cuts of meat. His sons were next in line, followed by their wives, and finally the children. This system created a sense of order and purpose within the family's cannibalistic practices and helped to prevent conflicts over the distribution of human flesh. The family had also developed specific techniques for identifying the most nutritious and flavorful parts of the human body. They had learned through years of experimentation that certain organs provided more energy and sustenance than others, and they had created detailed charts and diagrams showing the optimal methods for butchering and preparing human remains. The Ashcrofts' operation might have continued indefinitely, if not for a series of circumstances that began to draw unwanted attention to their activities. The first warning sign came in the fall of 1871, when a group of federal marshals stopped at the inn while pursuing a gang of outlaws who had robbed a bank in Little Rock. The marshals were experienced lawmen who had developed keen instincts for detecting deception and danger. Something about the Ashcroft family made them uneasy, though they could not identify any specific cause for concern. The family's hospitality was as warm as ever, the food was excellent, and the accommodations were comfortable. But the marshals noticed small details that troubled them: the way family members exchanged glances when they thought no one was looking, the fact that certain areas of the property seemed to be off-limits to guests, and most significantly, the discovery of personal items in the family's possession that seemed inconsistent with their claimed background. One of the marshals, Deputy Thomas Hartley, was particularly observant. He noticed that Jeremiah Ashcroft wore a pocket watch that bore the initials of someone else, and that Martha Ashcroft's wedding ring appeared to be far too expensive for a frontier farmer's wife. When Hartley casually inquired about these items, the explanations provided by the family members were vague and inconsistent. More troubling still was Hartley's discovery of what appeared to be human hair and bone fragments in the family's compost pile. When he brought this to the attention of his colleagues, they initially dismissed his concerns as the product of an overactive imagination. After all, the Ashcrofts were well-known and respected members of the community, and there was no evidence of any wrongdoing beyond a few suspicious coincidences. However, Hartley's concerns were reinforced when the marshals learned that several travelers who had been known to stop at the Ashcroft Inn had subsequently disappeared without a trace. In each case, the missing persons had been traveling alone or in small groups, and their failure to reach their destinations had been attributed to the many dangers of mountain travel. wild animals, accidents, outlaws, or simply becoming lost in the wilderness. When viewed individually, these disappearances seemed unremarkable. The Ozark Mountains were genuinely dangerous, and it was not uncommon for travelers to vanish without explanation. But when Hartley began to compile a list of missing persons who had last been seen in the vicinity of the Ashcroft Inn, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Over the course of nearly 20 years, at least 37 people had disappeared after staying at or near the Ashcroft property. The victims included merchants, settlers, missionaries, and even other lawmen who had been traveling through the region on official business. In most cases, their disappearances had been reported to local authorities, but the investigations had been perfunctory at best, hampered by the vast distances involved and the general assumption that the missing persons had simply fallen victim to the hazards of frontier life. Hartley's growing suspicions were shared with his superior, Marshal William Crawford, who authorized a discreet investigation into the Ashcroft family's background and activities. What this investigation revealed was deeply troubling. There was no record of Jeremiah Ashcroft or his family in Tennessee, despite their claims to have lived there for many years. The property deeds and business licenses associated with their Arkansas operation contained inconsistencies and apparent forgeries. Most significantly, several witnesses came forward to report that they had seen the Ashcrofts in possession of items that had belonged to missing travelers. However, gathering sufficient evidence to justify arrests and prosecutions proved challenging. The Ashcrofts were careful to maintain their facade of respectability, and they had cultivated relationships with local officials who were reluctant to believe accusations against such apparently upstanding citizens. Moreover, the isolated nature of their operation meant that there were few witnesses to their crimes, and much of the evidence had been carefully destroyed or concealed. The investigation also revealed that the Ashcrofts had been paying bribes to certain local officials to ensure that any reports of suspicious activities would be dismissed or ignored. They had cultivated relationships with corrupt judges, sheriffs, and territorial administrators who were willing to overlook irregularities in exchange for regular payments. This network of corruption had provided the family with advance warning of any investigations and had helped to suppress evidence that might have exposed their crimes. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. Samuel Morrison, the traveling merchant whose discovery would ultimately expose the Ashcroft operation, was not originally intended to be a victim. Morrison was a regular customer who had stayed at the inn multiple times over the years, and the family had always treated him well because his visits were predictable and his disappearance would be quickly noticed by his business associates. However, Morrison's final visit to the inn occurred under unusual circumstances. He had been forced to take shelter there during a severe winter storm that had made travel impossible for several days. During his extended stay, Morrison had the opportunity to observe the family's activities more closely than any previous guest, and what he saw gradually convinced him that something was terribly wrong. The first indication of trouble came when Morrison noticed that the family's meat stores seemed unusually extensive for a frontier household. Despite the harsh winter conditions that had made hunting difficult, the Ashcrofts had large quantities of preserved meat that they claimed came from their livestock. However, Morrison was an experienced trader who dealt in agricultural products, and he could tell that much of the meat did not come from cattle, pigs, or other common farm animals. When Morrison inquired about the source of the meat, the family's explanations were evasive and contradictory. Jeremiah claimed that they had been fortunate in their hunting, while Ezekiel suggested that they had traded with other settlers for surplus livestock. Martha insisted that they had simply been more successful than usual in preserving their autumn slaughter. The inconsistencies in these stories made Morrison increasingly suspicious. His suspicions deepened when he discovered personal items hidden in his room that clearly belonged to other travelers. Behind a loose board in the wall, Morrison found a leather wallet containing identification papers for a merchant named Robert Hayes, who Morrison knew had disappeared while traveling through the region several months earlier. The wallet also contained a significant amount of cash and a letter from Hayes's wife expressing concern about his delayed arrival home. Morrison realized that he was in mortal danger, but he also understood that he needed to gather more evidence if he hoped to expose the Ashcroft operation and bring the family to justice. Over the next 2 days, while pretending to be confined to his room by illness, Morrison conducted a careful search of the inn, looking for additional evidence of the family's crimes. What he discovered exceeded his worst fears. In the basement of the building, Morrison found the Ashcrofts processing area, complete with human remains in various stages of dismemberment and preservation. The sight was so horrific that Morrison was physically sick, but he forced himself to document what he had seen, making detailed notes and sketches that would later serve as crucial evidence. The basement chamber was a nightmare of systematic butchery that revealed the true extent of the Ashcrofts operation. Large wooden tables bore the stains of countless victims, while meat hooks suspended from the ceiling still held portions of human flesh in various stages of curing. Barrels of salt and smoking racks lined the walls, creating an efficient processing facility that could handle multiple victims simultaneously. Morrison also discovered a collection of personal effects that had belonged to dozens of victims: jewelry, watches, clothing, weapons, and documents that told the stories of lives cut short by the Ashcrofts' greed and depravity. Among these items were things that Morrison recognized as having belonged to people he had known personally, travelers who had simply vanished while passing through the region. Perhaps most disturbing of all was Morrison's realization that he had unknowingly consumed human flesh during his previous visits to the inn. The excellent stews and roasts that he had praised so highly had contained the remains of murdered travelers, and the Ashcrofts had watched with amusement as he and other guests had unknowingly participated in their cannibalistic practices. In one corner of the basement, Morrison discovered what appeared to be a crude laboratory, where the family experimented with different methods of preparing and preserving human flesh. Jars containing various organs and body parts lined the shelves, along with notebooks detailing the results of their gruesome experiments. The family had approached cannibalism with the same methodical precision that other frontier families might apply to farming or animal husbandry. The notebooks contained detailed observations about the nutritional value of different parts of the human body, recipes for preparing human flesh in various ways, and notes about which preservation methods produced the best results. The Ashcrofts had clearly spent years perfecting their techniques, treating their cannibalistic practices as a science rather than simply a means of survival. Morrison also found evidence that the family had been conducting experiments on living victims before killing them. Some of the notebooks contained descriptions of torture techniques and observations about human pain tolerance and psychological responses to extreme stress. The Ashcrofts had apparently derived pleasure not only from consuming their victims, but also from studying their suffering in detail. Among the most disturbing discoveries were detailed anatomical drawings that showed the optimal methods for dismembering human bodies to maximize the amount of usable meat. The drawings were accompanied by notes about which tools worked best for different types of cuts and how to minimize waste during the butchering process. The level of detail and precision in these documents suggested that the Ashcrofts had been refining their techniques for many years. Morrison also discovered evidence that the family had been selling human flesh to other isolated families in the region, creating a network of cannibalistic practices that extended far beyond their own property. Ledgers and correspondence revealed that the Ashcrofts had been supplying what they described as exotic game meat to at least a dozen other households, generating significant additional income from their gruesome enterprise. The family had developed an elaborate system of codes and euphemisms to disguise the true nature of their business correspondence. Human flesh was referred to as mountain venison, while different body parts were given various code names that would not arouse suspicion if the letters were intercepted. The sophistication of this system suggested that the Ashcrofts had been operating their cannibalistic network for many years without detection. Morrison understood that his own survival depended on maintaining the pretense that he suspected nothing while finding a way to escape and alert the authorities. He waited until the storm had passed and the family had relaxed their vigilance before making his move. On the morning of February 15, 1872, Morrison announced that he was feeling better and needed to resume his journey to meet important business obligations. The family seemed reluctant to let him leave, suggesting that the roads were still dangerous and that he should wait another day or two. But Morrison insisted that his business could not wait, and he began preparing for departure, despite their objections. As he loaded his wagon, Morrison noticed that several family members were watching him with expressions that seemed more threatening than concerned. Morrison's escape from the Ashcroft property was harrowing. As he drove his wagon down the mountain road, he became convinced that he was being followed by members of the family who intended to kill him before he could reach safety. He pushed his horses to their limits, taking dangerous shortcuts through terrain that could have easily resulted in a fatal accident. Several times, he thought he saw figures moving through the trees alongside the road, but he never stopped to investigate. The journey to safety was complicated by Morrison's knowledge that the Ashcrofts had contacts throughout the region who might warn them of his escape or attempt to intercept him before he could reach the authorities. He avoided the main roads and settlements where possible, traveling through wilderness areas that were difficult to navigate but offered better concealment from potential pursuers. During his flight, Morrison encountered several other travelers who offered assistance, but he was too paranoid to trust anyone. He feared that the Ashcrofts' network of contacts might include seemingly innocent people who would report his movements back to the family. This paranoia probably saved his life, as investigators would later discover that the Ashcrofts had indeed cultivated relationships with various individuals throughout the region who served as informants and early warning systems. Morrison's horses began to show signs of exhaustion after the first day of hard travel, forcing him to make difficult decisions about when to rest and when to push forward. He knew that stopping for extended periods would give his potential pursuers time to catch up, but he also understood that killing his horses would leave him stranded in the wilderness with no means of escape. On the second night of his journey, Morrison made camp in a secluded ravine where he hoped to remain hidden from anyone who might be tracking him. He built no fire and ate only cold food, spending the long hours of darkness listening for any sounds that might indicate the presence of pursuers. Several times during the night, he heard what sounded like voices in the distance, but he could never determine whether they were real or products of his increasingly paranoid imagination. It took Morrison 3 days of hard travel to reach the nearest town with a telegraph office, where he immediately contacted federal authorities and provided them with a detailed account of what he had discovered. His report was so extraordinary that it was initially met with skepticism, but the evidence he had gathered and the consistency of his story convinced Marshal Crawford that a full investigation was warranted. Crawford assembled a team of experienced lawmen and set out for the Ashcroft property, prepared for the possibility that they would encounter armed resistance. The journey to the inn took 2 days, during which the marshals discussed strategy and prepared for what they expected to be a dangerous confrontation with a family of murderers who had nothing left to lose. The marshals brought with them a warrant authorizing them to search the Ashcroft property and arrest any family members found there. They also carried additional supplies and equipment that would allow them to conduct a thorough investigation of the crime scene and preserve any evidence they might discover. However, when the law enforcement team arrived at the Ashcroft property on February 22, 1872, they found it completely abandoned. The family had vanished, taking with them most of their portable possessions and leaving behind only the evidence of their crimes. It appeared that they had received advance warning of the impending investigation, possibly through contacts in local law enforcement or government offices. The search of the abandoned inn revealed horrors that exceeded even Morrison's descriptions. In addition to the basement processing area, investigators discovered multiple burial sites on the property, containing the remains of dozens of victims. The bodies had been dismembered and partially consumed, with the remaining bones showing clear evidence of systematic butchering and meat removal. The investigators also found detailed records that the Ashcrofts had kept of their victims, including names, descriptions, estimated wealth, and notes about the quality of the meat obtained from each person. These records revealed that the family had murdered at least 43 people over the course of 19 years, making them responsible for one of the most extensive serial killing operations in American history. The evidence also showed that the Ashcroft operation had been far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. The family had maintained detailed maps of regional travel routes, schedules of regular travelers, and information about law enforcement activities in the area. They had cultivated relationships with corrupt officials who provided them with advance warning of investigations, and they had established multiple escape routes and safe houses throughout the region. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that the Ashcrofts had been selling human flesh to other isolated families in the region, creating a network of cannibalistic practices that extended far beyond their own property. Several other households were found to have been purchasing what they believed to be exotic game meat from the Ashcrofts, unknowingly participating in the consumption of human remains. The investigation into the Ashcroft network revealed that cannibalism was more widespread in the isolated regions of the Ozark Mountains than anyone had previously suspected. Economic hardship, cultural isolation, and the breakdown of traditional social structures had created conditions in which some families had turned to consuming human flesh as a survival strategy, gradually losing their moral inhibitions against such practices. Among the evidence discovered at the Ashcroft property were letters and documents that revealed the existence of at least 6 other families in the region who had been purchasing human flesh from the Ashcrofts or engaging in similar practices independently. These families had developed their own methods for obtaining and processing human meat, creating a loose network of cannibalistic communities that operated throughout the remote areas of the Arkansas mountains. The network operated through a complex system of trade and barter, with families exchanging human flesh for other goods and services. Some families specialized in obtaining victims, while others focused on processing and preservation. The Ashcrofts served as a central hub for this network, coordinating activities and maintaining communication between the various participants. The investigation revealed that the cannibalistic network had been operating for at least a decade before the Ashcrofts' crimes were discovered. The families involved had developed sophisticated methods for identifying and targeting potential victims, often working together to ensure that their activities would not be detected by law enforcement authorities. The manhunt for the Ashcroft family became one of the largest law enforcement operations in the history of the Arkansas Territory. Federal marshals, state militia, and local police scoured the region for months, following leads and investigating reports of suspicious activities. Rewards were offered for information leading to the capture of family members, and their descriptions were circulated throughout the frontier territories. Despite these extensive efforts, the Ashcrofts seemed to have vanished completely. There were occasional reports of sightings in remote areas of Arkansas, Missouri, and the Indian Territory, but none of these leads resulted in captures or confirmed identifications. The family's knowledge of the region and their network of contacts among the criminal and outlaw populations made them extremely difficult to track. The investigation did succeed in uncovering and dismantling the broader network of cannibalistic practices that the Ashcrofts had helped to establish. Several other families were arrested and prosecuted for their participation in the consumption and distribution of human flesh, though most claimed that they had been unaware of the true nature of the meat they had been purchasing. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by the unprecedented nature of the crimes and the lack of clear precedents for prosecuting cases involving systematic cannibalism. The territorial court struggled with questions about jurisdiction, evidence standards, and appropriate punishments for crimes that seemed to exist outside the normal framework of criminal law. The few family members who were eventually captured faced charges including murder, robbery, conspiracy, and the newly created offense of crimes against human dignity. The trials attracted national attention and helped to establish legal precedents for prosecuting cases involving extreme depravity and systematic violence against multiple victims. The impact of the Ashcroft case extended far beyond the immediate legal proceedings. The revelation that such extensive cannibalistic practices had been occurring in supposedly civilized territories shocked the American public and led to demands for increased law enforcement presence in frontier regions. The case also contributed to growing concerns about the moral and social effects of isolation and economic hardship on frontier communities. Medical and scientific experts who studied the case were particularly interested in the psychological aspects of the Ashcrofts' behavior. The family's ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while engaging in systematic murder and cannibalism challenged existing understanding of criminal psychology and the nature of moral development in extreme circumstances. Dr. Cornelius Whitman, a prominent alienist from Boston who studied the case extensively, concluded that the Ashcroft family represented an example of what he termed environmental moral degradation, the gradual erosion of ethical constraints under conditions of extreme isolation and survival pressure. According to Whitman's theory, the family had initially turned to cannibalism as a desperate survival measure, but had gradually lost their ability to distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable behavior. Other experts disagreed with this assessment, arguing that the systematic and calculating nature of the Ashcrofts' crimes indicated a level of premeditation and organization that went beyond simple moral degradation. They suggested that the family had deliberately chosen to engage in cannibalistic practices for reasons that included not only survival, but also psychological gratification and economic advantage. The debate over the Ashcrofts' motivations and mental state continued for decades, contributing to the development of new theories about criminal psychology and the factors that could lead ordinary people to commit extraordinary crimes. The case became a standard reference point for discussions about the nature of evil and the circumstances under which civilized behavior could break down completely. Dr. Whitman's research into the Ashcroft case led him to develop a comprehensive theory about the psychological mechanisms that enabled ordinary people to engage in extreme acts of violence and depravity. He identified several key factors that had contributed to the family's descent into cannibalism, including social isolation, economic desperation, the breakdown of traditional moral structures, and the gradual normalization of increasingly extreme behaviors. According to Whitman's analysis, the Ashcroft family had undergone a process of moral desensitization that had occurred gradually over many years. What had begun as isolated acts of violence committed under extreme circumstances had evolved into a systematic pattern of behavior that the family members had come to view as normal and acceptable. The search for the escaped Ashcroft family members continued for several years, but gradually diminished as other priorities claimed the attention of law enforcement agencies. By 1875, the active manhunt had been largely abandoned, though the family members remained on wanted lists, and occasional investigations were conducted when new information became available. Over the years, there were numerous reported sightings of Ashcroft family members in various locations throughout the American West. Some of these reports were undoubtedly cases of mistaken identity or deliberate hoaxes, but others seemed credible enough to warrant investigation. The family's ability to disappear so completely suggested that they had either died in the wilderness or had successfully established new identities in distant locations. In 1878, a man claiming to be Isaiah Ashcroft was arrested in California on charges unrelated to the original case. However, when investigators attempted to verify his identity and connection to the Arkansas murders, the man died in custody under suspicious circumstances before he could be properly questioned. Some officials suspected that he had been murdered to prevent him from revealing information about the other family members, but no evidence was ever found to support this theory. The most credible sighting of Ashcroft family members occurred in 1881, when a group of travelers in the New Mexico Territory reported encountering a family that matched the descriptions of the fugitives. According to these witnesses, the family was operating a small trading post in a remote area and seemed to be living under assumed names. However, by the time law enforcement officers reached the location, the family had once again vanished, leaving behind only circumstantial evidence of their presence. As the years passed and the original investigators retired or died, institutional memory of the Ashcroft case began to fade. The files were archived, the wanted posters were removed from circulation, and the case gradually became a historical curiosity rather than an active investigation. However, the impact of the case continued to influence law enforcement practices and legal procedures for decades to come. The Ashcroft case led to significant improvements in communication and coordination between law enforcement agencies in different territories and states. The family's ability to escape by crossing jurisdictional boundaries had highlighted the need for better information sharing and cooperative investigation techniques. New protocols were established for tracking fugitives across large geographic areas and for maintaining consistent records of criminal activities. The case also contributed to the development of more sophisticated investigative techniques, including the systematic documentation of crime scenes, the preservation of physical evidence, and the use of witness testimony to establish patterns of criminal behavior. Many of the methods used in the Ashcroft investigation became standard practices that are still used by law enforcement agencies today. Perhaps most importantly, The Ashcroft case helped to establish the principle that certain crimes are so heinous that they transcend normal jurisdictional limitations and require coordinated responses from multiple levels of government. This principle would later be incorporated into federal legislation dealing with serial killers and other criminals whose activities cross state boundaries. The abandoned Ashcroft property became a site of morbid fascination for travelers and curiosity seekers, despite efforts by local authorities to restrict access to the area. The inn-building was eventually demolished, but the foundations and some of the outbuildings remained as grim reminders of the horrors that had occurred there. Local folklore developed around the site, with stories of ghostly apparitions and supernatural phenomena that supposedly manifested in the area. In 1885, a group of investors attempted to purchase the Ashcroft property with the intention of developing it as a tourist attraction, capitalizing on the public's fascination with the case. However, local opposition and concerns about the appropriateness of commercializing such a tragic site led to the abandonment of these plans. The property was eventually acquired by the territorial government and designated as a memorial to the victims of the Ashcroft crimes. The memorial, which consisted of a simple stone marker listing the names of the known victims, became a place of pilgrimage for family members and friends of those who had been murdered. Annual memorial services were held at the site, and efforts were made to maintain it as a place of remembrance and reflection rather than sensationalized entertainment. However, the remote location and difficult access to the site made maintenance challenging, and over time, the memorial fell into disrepair. By the early 20th century, the marker had been damaged by weather and vandalism, and the site had largely been forgotten except by local historians and the descendants of victims. The story of the Ashcroft family continued to fascinate writers, researchers, and true crime enthusiasts well into the modern era. Numerous books, articles, and academic studies were published about the case, each attempting to provide new insights into the motivations and methods of the family members. Some of these works focused on the criminal aspects of the case, while others examined the social and psychological factors that had contributed to the family's descent into cannibalism and murder. One of the most comprehensive studies of the case was published in 1923 by Dr. Margaret Thornton, a criminologist who had spent several years researching the Ashcroft crimes and their aftermath. Thornton's work, titled The Ashcroft Murders, A Study in Frontier Depravity, provided detailed analysis of the evidence and offered new theories about the psychological development of the family members. According to Thornton's research, the Ashcroft family's criminal activities had begun much earlier than previously suspected, possibly dating back to their time in Tennessee before their move to Arkansas. She uncovered evidence suggesting that several unexplained disappearances in Tennessee during the 1840s and early 1850s might have been connected to the family, indicating that their cannibalistic practices had developed gradually over a much longer period than originally believed. Thornton's work also provided new insights into the family's organizational structure and decision-making processes. Based on surviving evidence and witness testimony, she concluded that Jeremiah Ashcroft had been the primary leader and organizer of the criminal operation, but that all adult family members had participated willingly and enthusiastically in the murders and cannibalistic practices. Perhaps most disturbing was Thornton's analysis of the psychological effects of the family's crimes on the younger generation. She found evidence that the Ashcroft children had been systematically indoctrinated into the family's cannibalistic practices from an early age, suggesting that they had never developed normal moral inhibitions against consuming human flesh or participating in murder. This finding raised troubling questions about the nature of moral development and the extent to which criminal behavior could be transmitted from one generation to the next through environmental conditioning. Thornton's work contributed to ongoing debates about the relative importance of heredity versus environment in shaping criminal behavior, and her conclusions influenced the development of new theories about the prevention and treatment of violent crime. The Ashcroft case also had significant impact on the development of forensic science and criminal investigation techniques. The systematic documentation of the crime scenes and the preservation of physical evidence provided valuable learning opportunities for investigators and medical examiners who were working to develop more scientific approaches to criminal investigation. Dr. Harrison Mills, a physician who had participated in the examination of the Ashcroft crime scenes, published several papers describing the forensic techniques that had been used in the investigation. His work helped to establish standards for the documentation of homicide scenes and the preservation of human remains as evidence in criminal cases. Mills's research was particularly valuable in developing methods for distinguishing between different types of trauma and determining the sequence of events that had led to a victim's death. His analysis of the Ashcroft victims' remains provided insights into the family's killing methods and helped to establish timelines for the various murders that had been committed. The case also contributed to advances in the field of anthropology, as researchers studied the cultural and social factors that had enabled the Ashcroft family's cannibalistic practices to develop and persist. The isolation and economic hardship experienced by many frontier families had created conditions in which traditional moral and social constraints could break down, leading to the adoption of survival strategies that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Anthropologist Dr. James Whitfield conducted extensive research into the cultural context of the Ashcroft crimes, examining the ways in which frontier conditions had influenced the development of alternative social structures and moral systems. His work helped to explain how families like the Ashcrofts could maintain their criminal activities for extended periods without detection or intervention from outside authorities. Whitfield's research also provided insights into the role of isolation in shaping human behavior and the importance of social connections in maintaining moral and ethical standards. His conclusions suggested that the breakdown of traditional community structures in frontier regions had created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by individuals or families with criminal inclinations. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Ashcroft case had become firmly established as one of the most significant criminal cases in American history. The systematic nature of the family's crimes, the extent of their cannibalistic practices, and their successful evasion of justice had created a legacy that continued to influence law enforcement, legal procedures, and academic research. The case had also become part of American folklore, inspiring numerous fictional works and contributing to the development of the horror and true crime genres in popular literature. The story of the Ashcroft family served as a powerful reminder of the potential for evil that existed within seemingly ordinary people, and of the importance of maintaining vigilance against those who would prey upon the innocent and vulnerable. However, the most lasting impact of the Ashcroft case may have been its contribution to the development of modern concepts of justice and human rights. The systematic murder and consumption of dozens of innocent travelers represented a form of evil that challenged traditional notions of crime and punishment, forcing society to confront the reality that some acts were so heinous that they required new forms of legal and moral response. The case helped to establish the principle that certain crimes transcend normal jurisdictional and temporal limitations, and that society has an obligation to pursue justice for victims regardless of the practical difficulties involved. This principle would later be incorporated into international law and would influence the development of concepts such as crimes against humanity and universal jurisdiction. In the early 20th century, renewed interest in the Ashcroft case led to several attempts to locate the missing family members or their descendants. Private investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths conducted extensive research into possible leads and sightings, but none of these efforts resulted in definitive conclusions about the fate of the fugitive family members. Some researchers became convinced that the Ashcrofts had successfully established new identities and had continued their criminal activities in other locations under different names. They pointed to patterns of unexplained disappearances and suspicious deaths in various parts of the American West that seemed to match the methods used by the Ashcroft family in Arkansas. Other investigators concluded that the family had most likely died in the wilderness during their flight from justice, victims of the same harsh conditions that had claimed the lives of many other travelers in the region. The lack of confirmed sightings after the early 1880s seemed to support this theory, as did the practical difficulties of maintaining false identities and avoiding detection for extended periods. A third group of researchers suggested that some family members might have survived and integrated into legitimate society, abandoning their criminal activities and living out their lives under assumed identities. This theory was based on the assumption that the younger family members might have been less committed to the cannibalistic practices than their elders and might have been willing to abandon their criminal lifestyle when given the opportunity. The debate over the fate of the Ashcroft family continued well into the modern era, with new theories and supposed evidence emerging periodically to reignite interest in the case. However, the passage of time and the lack of definitive proof made it increasingly unlikely that the truth about the family's ultimate fate would ever be established with certainty. In 1972, exactly 100 years after Samuel Morrison's discovery of the Ashcroft crimes, a commemorative ceremony was held at the site of the former inn to honor the memory of the victims and to reflect on the lessons that could be learned from the case. The ceremony was attended by descendants of victims, law enforcement officials, historians, and members of the general public who were interested in preserving the memory of this tragic chapter in American history. The centennial commemoration included the installation of a new memorial marker that listed the names of all known victims and provided a brief summary of the case for future visitors to the site. The ceremony also featured presentations by historians and criminologists who discussed the ongoing significance of the Ashcroft case and its influence on the development of modern law enforcement and criminal justice practices. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a great-granddaughter of Samuel Morrison, spoke at the ceremony about the lasting impact of the case on her family and the importance of remembering the victims of the Ashcroft crimes. She emphasized that while the case represented a dark chapter in American history, it also demonstrated the courage and determination of individuals like her great-grandfather who had risked their lives to expose evil and seek justice for the innocent. The centennial commemoration also served as an opportunity to reflect on the broader social and cultural factors that had contributed to the Ashcroft crimes and to consider what lessons could be applied to contemporary issues. Speakers discussed the importance of maintaining strong community connections and social support systems to prevent the kind of isolation and moral degradation that had enabled the Ashcroft family's criminal activities. As the 21st century began, the Ashcroft case continued to attract attention from researchers, writers, and true crime enthusiasts who were drawn to its combination of historical significance and enduring mystery. New technologies and investigative techniques offered the possibility of uncovering additional evidence or solving some of the remaining questions about the case, but the passage of time had made such discoveries increasingly unlikely. The case had also become a subject of academic study in fields ranging from criminology and psychology to anthropology and American history. Universities offered courses that examined the Ashcroft crimes as examples of extreme criminal behavior and as illustrations of the social and cultural conditions that had existed on the American frontier. The story of the Ashcroft family served as a powerful reminder of the capacity for evil that exists within human nature and of the importance of maintaining vigilance against those who would exploit the trust and vulnerability of others. It also demonstrated the crucial role that ordinary citizens like Samuel Morrison could play in exposing crime and seeking justice, even at great personal risk. Perhaps most importantly, the Ashcroft case illustrated the fundamental importance of human dignity and the obligation that society has to protect the innocent and vulnerable from those who would prey upon them. The systematic murder and consumption of dozens of travelers represented not just individual crimes, but an assault on the basic values and principles that hold civilized society together. The legacy of the Ashcroft case continues to influence contemporary discussions about crime, justice, and human nature. As society grapples with new forms of violence and exploitation, the lessons learned from this 19th century case remain relevant and important. The story serves as a reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, and that the price of safety and justice is eternal vigilance. The victims of the Ashcroft crimes, merchants, settlers, missionaries, and travelers who had simply been seeking safe passage through dangerous territory, deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in a criminal case, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by unimaginable cruelty. Their stories serve as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of never forgetting those who have suffered at the hands of evil. In the end, The true horror of the Ashcroft case lies not just in the systematic murder and cannibalism that the family practiced, but in the betrayal of trust that their crimes represented. Travelers who sought shelter and hospitality at their inn had every reason to expect safety and protection, but instead found themselves victims of a family that had abandoned every principle of human decency in pursuit of profit and perverse satisfaction. The fact that such crimes could be committed by people who appeared to be ordinary, respectable members of society serves as a sobering reminder that evil can take many forms and that appearances can be deceiving. The Ashcroft family's ability to maintain their facade of respectability while engaging in systematic murder and cannibalism demonstrates the importance of looking beyond surface appearances and remaining alert to signs of danger and deception. As we reflect on the Ashcroft case more than a century and a half after the crimes were committed, we are reminded of both the depths to which human beings can sink and the heights to which they can rise. The courage of Samuel Morrison in exposing the crimes, the dedication of the law enforcement officers who investigated them, and the persistence of those who have worked to preserve the memory of the victims all demonstrate the better angels of human nature. The story of the Ashcroft family will likely continue to fascinate and horrify future generations, serving as a permanent reminder of the importance of justice, vigilance, and human dignity. While the family members themselves may have escaped earthly justice, their crimes have not been forgotten, and their victims have not died in vain if their stories continue to serve as warnings about the dangers that can lurk behind the most innocent facades. The creepy and disturbing case of the Ashcroft family, who turned strangers into supper, remains one of the most shocking examples of systematic cannibalism and murder in American history. Their story serves as a dark chapter in the nation's past, but also as a testament to the importance of courage, justice, and the fundamental human obligation to protect the innocent from those who would do them harm.